Today's scripture reading brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 24. At the end of chapter 23, Saul had David pinned in. Saul was on one side of the mount, David was on the other. Saul began to encompass the mount when he got word that the Philistines were attacking, so he called off the hunt and took his people and went to fight the Philistines, and that was in Maon. After Saul had left, David and his company had retreated unto the wilderness of Engedi, and that's where chapter 24 picks up. After Saul gets done fighting the Philistines, he comes back to pursue David once again to Engedi. And I have the first 7 verses titled as this. Let me get it pulled up there. David spares Saul in a cave in Engedi. Saul and his company of 3,000 chosen men went to Engedi to resume the hunt for David. And then what happens in verse number 3, it says, and he came to the sheepcotes, by the way, speaking of Saul, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet. What that means is Saul went into the cave to use the bathroom. He went there to relieve himself. And unbeknownst to Saul, as he went in that cave and is in a very vulnerable state, David and his men are in that cave, the very same cave. And the men are saying, and they're like talking, out of earshot of Saul, but they're whispering, saying, man, this is your time. God has delivered him unto you. And think of how easy it would have been. Think of how easy it would have been to justify murdering Saul in that cave if you're David. I mean, this is a man that has already tried to kill you a few times. He's been hunting for you down for a long time now. You have had to leave your family. You are on the run, living a life of a vagabond. David could have very easily drawn up the knife and killed Saul. You see, but there's a difference between killing people when you're in a war or in self-defense versus killing somebody in that type of manner. That wasn't war. That would have been murder. David didn't do that for a number of reasons. But also, not only David's restraining of himself, but consider how much faith they would have had in David for his men not just to jump on this opportunity and seize and kill Saul themselves. Because you have to remember, David's men, their fate rested on David. So if David makes a dumb move, then those men could suffer death. So what David does instead of killing Saul, Saul had evidently taken his robe off to do his business, and he had set it down. David had access to the robe, and he cut the corner of the robe off. And this indicated 3 things, okay? Number 1, it was a sign of disrespect to the king, and that's why it says there in verse number 5, and it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he'd cut off Saul's skirt, because he had disrespected God's anointed, showed him that type of disrespect. Secondly, it showed that David essentially had a claim to the king's robe, and he did. God had, through Samuel, anointed David to be king. He was king in waiting. Everybody knew it. We see in this chapter, Saul himself even knew it. But he had a portion of the king's robe, so to speak. But then the last thing that it communicated is the most important when it's concerning this portion of Scripture, and that is it demonstrated mercy. David, instead of cutting the head off of Saul, he cut the corner off of his robe, and that's mercy. He recognized it. Saul recognized it. And so there's that. So the first 7 verses, David spares Saul in a cave in Engedi. So after this, we see, let's get this brought up here. Verses 8 through 15, David speaks to Saul of his innocence. Saul gets done with his business and he exits the cave. David runs out after Saul has made a little bit of distance between he and David. David runs out and he shouts at Saul. Now, this is a very brazen act because he's calling attention to who he is and where he's at. And he calls out unto Saul, and in this just consider the chance that David has taken by revealing himself, not only him, but his men as well. But a few things to recognize here. You see in verse number 10, David recognized that Saul was the Lord's anointed. David understood that at any moment in time, God could have taken Saul out, but he hadn't yet. So therefore, David was still respecting the office of the king, if not the person. He was certainly respecting the office. And then we also see David's humility demonstrated multiple times in this scripture. At the beginning of this conversation, at the end of the scripture, we see in verse number 8 that as David went out crying out after Saul, and he calls unto him, Saul turns around and looks, and David is stooped down, bowing down unto Saul. So he's showing this great humility there. And then at the end of this conversation, there in verse number 14, he says, after whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? That's how David is referring to himself. You see such humility in the character of David. And that reminded me of Proverbs 15:33. It says, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. David would be honored one day, but he was certainly showing his humility prior to this. Just the same as our King Jesus. Jesus humbled himself, was full of humility simply by coming to this earth, but certainly in demonstrating and washing the feet of the apostles there before his crucifixion, before he is set at the right hand of the Father, and before his kingdom comes to this earth. And I'm looking forward to that day. We see verses 8 through 15, David speaks to Saul of his innocence. He cries out and essentially as a lawyer does, he makes his case unto Saul, and he shows him this skirt. He says, I could have killed you, but I didn't. And then we see lastly here in verse 16 through 22, through the remainder of the chapter, I have that titled, Saul confesses his guilt and returns home. This is a moment of sanity for Saul, because we see the most sanity we've seen in a long time in Saul in these few verses right here. He lifted up his voice and wept. He called David his son. He remembered that loving relationship and how David had been to him. He recalled all of that. He saw the wickedness in which he was doing to David and the goodness in which David had shown unto him. And then we see there in verse number 20, he says, and I know, behold, and now, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Saul knew it was over and done. He knew what the end of this story was going to be. And so he asked David something in verse number 21. He says, swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore unto Saul. Now, the sad thing about it is, once we get to Proverbs chapter 31, you'll see that, it was Saul himself and his sin that cut off his seed after him. And only one remained from Saul, and that would be Jonathan's son. All right, so that's going to be 1 Samuel chapter 24. I hope this has been a help and a blessing to you, and Lord willing, we'll see you again soon.